It came from just like a really small idea that just felt like one of those features that we built to bring joy rather than, necessarily to have some like deep clinical impact. But actually maybe those little joyful moments are the things that are really protecting people against some more significant mental health harms.
Hello and welcome to the Reflective Impact Entrepreneurs, the show that explores the stories of founders who listen, experiment, and reflect as they build ventures that do good and do well. I'm Umi, and each episode we meet some of those founders. Today I'm joined by Zareen from COGS AI. For listeners who may not know you yet, please introduce yourself and share what's one thing you're trying to change in the world and why do we need COGS AI right now?
Awesome. Well, hello, really happy to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm Zareen. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a startup called COGS AI. We build mental health technologies specifically for neurodivergent people. So things like ADHD and autism. And we mainly work with the UK public sector. So with the NHS and with local governments in England and Wales. So 15 to 20% of the global population are neurodivergent. That's around 1.2 billion people. And if you look at healthcare indicators for neurodivergent people, and this is across mental health and physical health, they tend to be doing a lot worse. So, for example, 50 to 70% of people with ADHD will also experience anxiety and depression. And there's so many more statistics like that. I'm not really going to go into it because we're trying to focus on the positives, but that's really one of the core reasons why me and my co-founder Felix started this business together.
Amazing. What was happening in your world that made this problem impossible to ignore? And was there a moment when it stopped just becoming an observation and it became something that you had to just act on?
Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say there was just one moment. It was almost an accumulated collection of moments over time. So it probably started when I was working in health tech. I was working as a product manager. And at the same time, I was volunteering at a few children's charities, including one where I was working in a school for young people with, and I'm putting this in air quotes, but young people with behavioral difficulties. And so that was a term that was used by the school and by the charity to describe these young people. But actually, when I was working with them, it didn't seem that it was behavioral difficulties. It seemed more like these were neurodivergent young people who weren't having their needs met. And so were reacting to an environment that wasn't catered to them rather than something being fundamentally wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously at the time, I'm putting into words now, which sound very coherent, but at the time I was just picking up on things where I was like, this doesn't feel right. And I just wanted to learn more about it myself. So I went and studied. I did a master's in educational neuroscience. Then I came and worked in a school as a teaching assistant for young people with special educational needs. So kind of the formal educational term for neurodiversity. And whilst I was working in the school environment, I again just kept on picking up on little ways in which, okay, if we use technology, maybe we could solve this problem or we can make things a little bit better within this environment for young people. And it was, just the accumulated collection of those moments that led me to want to start a company.
So you've been on this long, like a long journey of exploration and seeing these key moments where you're like, actually, maybe I could fix this. How long has it been since you've been developing COGS AI?
So it's just over 4 years. We started August 2021 is when we officially set up the company. But Felix and I had been working on the idea in the background probably for about 3 months before that, just testing out different concepts and just speaking to people and doing some research to make sure there was actually legs to it.
Amazing. I'm going to want to get into the way that you researched the challenge space a little later. But before that, you shared the moment it became impossible to ignore. You know, these kind of key moments in your life. I want to get a little bit into like how you started to tune in to these people, and I'd love to explore things such as like whose needs, pains, or desires did you tune into first? Was it like customers or beneficiaries? Was it like the students that you mentioned, or colleagues or community or your own lived experience?
The first inspiration would have been neurodivergent young people, specifically within school settings. So actually, when we first started the company, it was an ed tech company. And so we were looking to find ways of making educational content more accessible to people with different neurodivergent needs. And that was really the first pain point we started delving into. And obviously, with my background working in the school, it was the one that was most obvious to me. However, it changed and became something that was looking at the wider ecosystem around how neurodivergent people needed support. And that was really because of the business problem, actually, because once we flipped from looking at the student and then thought, okay, who is going to actually buy this solution for the student, and delved into the needs of schools, we realized that schools just didn't have the funding to pay for something like this.
Mhm.
And so as a business, it wasn't feasible. But it also did cause us to speak to more people in the neurodivergent support ecosystem. So we spoke to parents of neurodivergent young people. We also spoke to neurodivergent adults as well. And for context, this was just coming out of the pandemic where mental health was really becoming an issue for everyone, but particularly for neurodivergent people. And so both parents and adults, neurodivergent adults themselves, were talking about how much of a challenge their mental health was. And almost that was the core thing that they were focused on right now, rather than actually education. So even for a parent of a neurodivergent child, they're going to prioritize the mental health of their child over the education because their child can't engage in education unless they're mentally well.
For the listeners, could you explain a little bit more into how you went about doing the research? I mean, your team, and you've been amazing at this. I know I've worked with you over the years. What would you share about kind of how you went about those interviews or that preliminary research? How did you go about doing that? What were the activities and that sort of thing?
So we started with in-depth, semi-structured user interviews. So to actually recruit parents and neurodivergent adults, we just went out to our network and asked, we're building this company. Does anybody know anyone who would want to speak to us? And because I'd worked in the school before as well, I reached out and was like, are there any parents who'd be, happy to share anything? And through that, we got probably about 10 to 15, I can't remember exactly the number, of adults and parents that we were speaking to. And we kept it very broad because we knew we wanted to explore not just a specific question, but almost understand the just the day-to-day experience that people were going through. Because I think it was one of those, I guess, one of those areas where there's so many different ways that neurodivergent people and their families are experiencing problems. So going in with like a hard theory of like, okay, we're going to start with education or we're going to start with mental health was almost too directed. So we wanted to really see what emerged from the narratives that people were telling us throughout the interviews. So those first ones were very loose in terms of the structure. And then after we'd done the first round of interviews, you could start to see insights coming out and themes. And that was really where the mental health element started to come out. And then after that, we ran a second round of interviews where we just delved specifically into mental health. But that's where we also brought in desk research as well to kind of just delve in a little bit more into the statistics around mental health, into the reasons for it. Because I think it's quite interesting when you're building a healthcare product. Obviously, we're trying to solve things for the user, so their lived experience and how they want to feel when they're going through your product is so important. But you also need to make sure you understand the clinical context and the healthcare context as well.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. There's so many different layers of this of
Mhm.
the system to see how they connect together. Do you still do that at COGS AI? Do you still do that kind of level of kind of research and that engagement with the end user?
So we actually now engage with users in quite a lot of different ways because we have a much larger user base. So we have around 6,500 people who are using the product, mainly coming through the NHS. And we reach out to them via intercom. So we have an integration in the mobile app where we can target users based on how they've been using the product. So if we know someone's been using one feature a lot, we can send them a message and say, hey, would you like to take part in some research? You can either talk to us and we'll do a user interview and send you an Amazon voucher, or we can just send you a survey and you can fill it out. And so because of that, we have essentially automated the recruitment process for getting research participants through.
Mhm.
And we get quite a lot of feedback just constantly because of that. So we really embedded it into our culture. And all of our product development is driven by insights that we get from users. That's really how we prioritize.
Love it. I can see that in your work over the years. But with this loop of continuous connection with your end users and your customers, um, what's the most uncomfortable feedback you receive from people that you're supporting, and how did you respond?
Hmm. We once received some feedback saying that they thought the content in the app was too woke. And we didn't respond to that. We were just sort of like, well, we've chosen it to be diverse for a reason. And that's, something in our company culture that we want to stand by. And so it just didn't feel like it was something where we wanted to engage in a conversation. And so I'd say that's an example of something where it was a bit uncomfortable because also it made us think we had, I guess, there were things that we wanted to represent as a company. But yeah, essentially we made almost, just like a cultural choice about how we wanted things to be. And so that was less about, I guess, like building features and more about the types of content and like the narratives we had in that content.
Seeing that kind of like the NHS is kind of a key client and you receive that feedback, how did that make you feel?
So it wasn't from the NHS, it was from a user.
Is from an end user. Okay.
And we always report our feedback to the NHS anyway. So we had with whatever NHS trust that we're working with, we tend to have monthly touch points where we'll give them some data analytics, but also anything that's come through that's interesting from a qualitative perspective. And so you show positives and negatives. And so, yeah, we were like, oh, we've also got some feedback around being too woke. But for the trust, that it didn't bother them too much because the reason that they're procuring us is also because we're hitting a certain demographic for them as well. Just the way the sort of like look and feel of the app, and I guess even maybe like an app-based format for this kind of support. So they're targeting more, say, like 18 to 30-year-olds. And the feedback had come from someone, a little bit older, maybe not quite in that demographic.
Right. And I think this just leads us right on to like, if I'd spent a day with one of your customers before COGS AI was in the world, where would have I seen the most friction or frustration? And maybe also reflect on not only the end user, but also your customer, the NHS.
So for the end user, most of our users are people who are on waiting lists to get a diagnosis, say for ADHD or for autism. And they can be on those waiting lists for years. So one of the trusts that we work with, the waiting list for ADHD diagnoses is up to 5 years. And for a lot of the people who then come onto the product, it's actually the first touch point that they've had for, maybe since getting referred onto the waiting list, they haven't heard anything from the trust for a few years. And then they get an email from the trust saying, hey, do you want to download this app? So on one hand, they're very grateful to have something that can support them. But on the other hand, they still feel very lost in terms of where am I in the process? And it's quite interesting for us because people then synonymize us with being the NHS. So they'll reach out to us and ask, hey, any update on when I'm going to get my diagnosis appointment and things like that. Or, yeah, they reach out to customer support with questions that aren't really about us or about the app. It's about more the NHS process. And we do sometimes try and respond or refer them kind of back to the right person. But that's actually the majority of the customer support requests that we get rather than being technical support requests or anything like that.
Mhm.
And then from the perspective of the NHS, so again, it's very varied because when trusts are procuring us, they're not just looking for, oh, I need a neurodiversity solution. They'll often come in with a very specific remit. So, for example, one of our trusts is looking for support for people on waiting lists. That's the example that I gave. Another trust is looking for support for young people who may have had a diagnosis already, but are in that sort of interim stage where actually they're not getting day-to-day support or something that's a little bit more intensive, because even if you have a diagnosis, there's then another waiting list to try and get, I guess, an appointment for additional support. And so there's very specific use cases that each trust is looking at us to help support and kind of fill that need. And so we tailor the offer slightly, um, per trust, but also we talk about working with other services as well to make sure that what we're giving is kind of the best wraparound support for each beneficiary that comes through.
So what I'm hearing is for both beneficiary and customer, if COGS wasn't doing what it's doing now, there'd be a lot of waiting around
Yeah.
with not really much support.
Yeah, 100%. And for some of our users, the types of questions that we ask them in the onboarding flow, for example, where we just ask them to identify some of their neurodivergent traits. And it's could be the first time they've actually been formally asked to do an exercise like that because they would have done their own research and spoken to a GP, and that's what would have led them to be referred onto the waiting list. But actually taking the time to reflect on yourself in a little bit more of an in-depth way is something that no one has probably gone through with them yet. So that's the reason we actually designed our onboarding to be as in-depth as that.
Well, that's lovely, isn't it? And everyone likes a kind of a good user experience with that as well. I've certainly worked on projects where people have gone, "Oh, we never get nice things to work with. What you've done with the product is phenomenal as well. It's like really usable, but you kind of enjoy using it as well. It kind of has a bit of delight to it, although its context is sometimes not so delightful. But yeah, it's
Hmm.
great.
I mean, I can go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, please do.
Actually, one of our design principles is joy. So
Mm.
rather than neurodivergent people feeling like there's something wrong with them or that they're ill or that they have a disorder, actually their brains work differently. And that's kind of wonderful. Obviously, there are difficulties that come with that as well. So we're not trying to downplay that. But even the color scheme that we chose to use, we stayed away from very medicalized, greens and blues and actually focused on much more of a warmer palette. And we want people to feel kind of held when they go through the process. And it's a little bit vibey as well. So it's just, yeah, we want people to feel good aesthetically and emotionally when they're using it.
That's amazing. So listening, tuning in is one thing, but doing something about it is another, right? What was the first small test you tried to see if your idea had any legs?
Well, so there's sort of been a very long time ago. And I'm gonna define a test as something a little bit more formal, like a prototype, rather than user research.
Sure.
And yeah, so the very first prototype I built in a programming language called R, which is a data analysis language. Because I'm not a software engineer, but could use that language to build a small web app. And so I did that and put in some mental health content and different journeys. Essentially, something which, in a very, very basic way, replicates the flow that we have now, which is you do a couple of questions at the beginning, sort of screener questions, then you get put on a path of personalized sort of like learning content around mental health and neurodiversity, and also solutions for how you can support yourself in the moment. And we were just putting content from YouTube, for example, like rather than creating anything ourselves. And yeah, just put that out, ran some, I think, Facebook ads to try and push people onto it, and just collected the data from that to see, is this even interesting to anyone? Is anyone going to click on the ad and then go through and actually engage with the prototype? It was for free, they didn't have to pay anything. And then once they're in the prototype, just again looking at the analytics of where people are focusing, where they're dropping off, what seems to be getting the most engagement.
And whilst the Facebook ads are out there, who were testing the prototype, was there a moment, a bit of data or insight or something, um, this might actually address kind of what you set out to achieve?
It was looking at our cost per download and then speaking to other founders and just doing research around just getting a baseline for what their cost per download was. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was just significantly cheaper than we expected. And so for us, that was just a really definite proof point that there is demand, right?
Mm.
Because more people who are coming through are clicking. And, that's just like a clear indicator that people need this or need something like this.
Could you unpick that a little bit more for the listeners
Hmm.
who might be new to that?
Sure. So when you run an ad, you can say a Facebook ad or a social media ad, you can see how many people have clicked on that ad and then gone to use your product or prototype or whatever it is that it points to. And from that, you can determine per user almost the cost per getting one user to download something. So that's sort of like a cost per click or a cost per download. And the higher that number is, the more users will have had to have seen your ad before a certain number convert and actually download it. And so for us, and so that makes the cost a bit higher because more ads have to be shown. Whereas for us, the cost was low because the ad would be shown to say like 10 people, and I don't know, 8 out of those 10 people would click. Whereas for, a different ad where only 2 out of those 10 people would have to click, they'd have to be shown to more people to get the same number of people downloading it. So it's just an indicator that actually more people are interested in what we're building because fewer of them had to have seen that to have clicked it.
Thank you for taking us through that. You did it so well, so articulated it so well and so clearly. What was the last test you ran?
So we are actually working on a new product. So it's an LLM based neurodiversity coach. And it's in the testing phase at the moment where we've done the user research. We've built it's not even a prototype. It's beyond that. It's almost production ready. So almost ready to be, released out into the wild for people to start using it. But we just want to make sure that it's having the right impact on our users. So we're doing a lot of essentially just letting beta testers take it, play with it, use it as if it was something that was embedded into their real life, just so we can understand where the value is for them and are people using it. So this is a very interesting stage of this product development because we're getting a lot of usage, but what that is doing is actually pushing up our unit costs. So the costs to actually kind of roll this out to each individual user. And so where we're at with that product at the moment is that it's actually too expensive to run from a cost perspective to release. So we'll have to build something in where we actually either limit usage or like as in limit the number of times a user can engage with it over a month, for example. So we cap it at a certain price point, or to find a different pricing model where we might have to price it a little bit more expensively. But in that case, we wouldn't be able to sell it to the UK public sector. So we might actually, it might need its own separate business model. So that's a very interesting business case for me because I've always worked in consumer mobile. So even when in health tech, it was a mobile app that was, direct to consumer. So the running costs of that are obviously so low. That's one of the great things about that type of technology. You can scale it really easily. And so actually having to think about, okay, how do we optimize this for costs when that actually seems to come into conflict with how the users want to engage with it? Because in every other product, more usage is good, right? So
Yes.
yeah, it's an interesting problem. So that's currently what we're unpicking.
Is the driver behind that the tokens on an LLM every time you're making a call, it's costing you?
It's actually not the LLM token. So we use a method called RAG. So it's retrieval augmented generation, which is a way of saving the user's context and then referring to that context every time the user engages with the product. So it feels very personalized.
Hmm.
Um, and it's actually that method where we've kind of gone for almost like the best context. So it feels very good when you're engaging with it.
Hmm.
But obviously that comes at a cost of every time the user engages, it goes to the sort of like RAG memory context and it retrieves a bunch of things and then comes back. But the more it does, the higher the cost is. So we have to find ways of optimizing that part of the technical infrastructure. So it's not really a big problem. It's like there's so many people working on this at the moment. So it's quite like there is a solution, but it'll be, I think, a combination of a technical solution and then maybe something around kind of the user experience as well.
Wow. I look forward to having a go on that. If your previous products, anything to go by, I think this is going to be amazing as well.
Thank you.
Let's hone into the last experiment you ran, this new product that you're building. What experiment did you run to get a better signal that this is the route that we want to go down? You had your app, which is used in the NHS. What was the driver to go, actually, we need to grow this. We need to, this new technology will afford us something new. What was that moment? What were you thinking right before you either ran the experiment or just pressed go on that?
So the inspiration had actually been feedback on one of the features in the mobile app. So we have a journaling feature, and people wanted it to be more interactive. And
Hmm.
because LLMs were readily available at the time, we thought, oh, this is a perfect use case for an LLM where you have a knowledge bank in the sense of you have people who have been writing in about their experiences. You have another big knowledge bank, which is just all the knowledge around neurodiversity. And you can have a journal which actually responds to what you're experiencing and gives you sort of personalized neurodivergent support tips with that. But we didn't want to build it into the main product, so into the mobile app, because we work with the NHS, so we have to be a little bit careful when we're experimenting with new things. We need to make sure that from a clinical perspective, it's very safe.
Hmm.
And we also need to de-risk it from the trust perspective. And at the time, NHS Trust were just like, oh, anything that has an LLM in it, we're kind of freaked out by the data protection regulations around it and the clinical safety considerations. So it was just a hard no from them. So that's why we actually chose to build it out separately as a web app as well, rather than a mobile app, because with a web app, you can iterate much faster because you don't have to push onto app stores and things like that either.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think it didn't feel particularly risky to when we were running that experiment compared to the very first one where it was like, do people even want this? It's the first time you put something out into the real world that isn't just, people that you know who are testing it. I think that always makes you feel a little bit like, wow, like real people want this, not just friends who are just saying things because they're being nice. Whereas this one felt less risky because we just gotten so much feedback around the reflection feature, so the journaling feature, and that people wanted it to be more interactive. So it just felt that the pain point was coming from, you know, like a lot of data that we collected over time. So I think it was less about is the need there and more about actually, do people want to engage with an LLM every day? Like, is there something weird about that? Would they rather have an in-person neurodiversity coach or a real person as a neurodiversity coach? And so it was really much more about the preferences around how they get that support. That was exciting. And then also we had done specific things to make sure that the support was really personalized right from the beginning. So testing out that method as well, because it was a way of collecting context from users that we hadn't really heard anyone doing before when they were building these types of products. And so it was more, I'd say, intellectual curiosity going in rather than kind of freaking out about, oh my God, is this going to work? Does anyone want this?
Yeah, so you kind of just gradually, you're kind of following that hunch, right? It's just like you've got a product that's already out there. You're seeing some signals from that product, and you're like, okay, let's follow this hunch and see where that kind of goes to. Kind of that um, strong opinions loosely held. So if you kind of learn something new, you're happy to kind of move through that. Does that feel right? Sort
Yeah,
of thing. Yeah.
100%.
So out of either of the examples that we spoke about, which is like the first experiment or your last experiment, has there been a moment when the learning came out of an experiment that surprised you?
I think it's been less about surprises from experiments and more about surprises from how people use the product in real life
Hmm.
and what the data shows you. So we use Mixpanel, which is a very standard analytics tool for mobile products and web-based products as well, I think. And you can break down in quite a lot of detail how people are using the product. And I think for us, there was one around just even which features are the most popular. So we built a feature just to be kind of like cute. So it's just like daily affirmations that people get, where we've just put in some text that talk about how, like, the good things about being neurodivergent. And so the point of that is to push back against the fact that there's so much negativity around neurodiversity, either in the workplace or at school. And so people will have absorbed that, and, that has negative impacts on people's self-esteem. And so we're like, oh, we'll just like send people a little affirmation. And that's actually one of the products that gets the most, sorry, one of the features that gets the most engagement, because A, it's quite low effort, right? People kind of click into it and they save something if they want it. But it was kind of, and people actually write in with feedback about it, or when we do interviews, they're like, oh, I really like the little messages, and, oh, can we like have more of those? And can that lead to more content? So actually a lot of people want to dive a little bit deeper into, okay, if we send them a message saying, this is like a good thing about being neurodivergent, they want to then go into like, oh, can we hear like a podcast about people talking about that topic? Or is there an article or any data that I can see around that? And so again, that was like, this has led to something for our product roadmap that we never even considered. And it came from just like a really small idea that just felt like one of those features that we built to bring joy rather than, necessarily to have some like deep clinical impact. But actually maybe those little joyful moments are the things that are really protecting people against some more significant mental health harms as well.
I like the way that you think about the journey that your product's going on, evolving different needs, but also consider new technologies. And there's that kind of curiosity that you have within the team that seems to be baked in, that comes from a design mind at the helm of the startup. So yes, hats off to you.
So I would say as well, like, my whole team are very like product minded. So even our software engineer, and I think we're also mainly neurodivergent team as
Mhm.
well. And so, yeah, I don't know if I mentioned that before. So I'm autistic. Our lead engineer is autistic, and we just work together on, on building things and coming up with ideas. Oh, and our designer is ADHD as well. And this isn't by design. It was just the types of people who seem to find their way here. But I think there's something about that, just having minds who have their own experience of the problem,
Mhm.
which can then work with a larger data set where you're getting both quantitative evidence from app usage and also qualitative evidence. And I think that sort of combination of three different perspectives really helps us build things which work for our users.
That's that's great. I think it shows in the work. It also shows in the culture that you've built there as well. Um, I want to move on to kind of reflection a
Mm.
little bit. So we talked about tuning in and experimentation, but experimentation, as you kind of also alluded to, is not just about kind of moving things forward. It's also about knowing when to pause or let something go. Was there a time when you chose to hold back and you're glad you did?
Ooh, good question. Probably not from a product perspective, more from a business perspective. I think sometimes people approach us with, like, it could be an NHS trust or someone externally who is interested in just neurodiversity generally. And then it's like, can you solve this problem for us? Because you do neurodiversity. And because as a team, we're quite curious and we like to build things, we're always like, oh, you know what, we could. And then we'll talk about it and then we'll decide, what, it's not really like it's taking us too far from the type of work that we do. We build technology. We actually get some people approaching us to be like, can you do research for us? Because obviously, what I described to you is like we have a research method embedded into how we build our tech, and we feed those insights back to trusts. But some trusts sometimes, or just clients sometimes, approach us just purely for research. And even though we intellectually find it interesting, we tend to turn those down
Mhm.
because doing good research in and of itself is a very specific skill set. Doing user research and product research is one thing, but more academic type research, we're like, that's probably not us, even though we could advise a little bit. But yeah, turning things like that down, even if we find it, uh, we would find it intellectually fascinating.
What is there a particular one that's a real tough call, like right on the edge? What made you kind of say no?
There's some, so especially something that comes from an NHS trust where, because the NHS is obviously very like resource poor, sometimes just like what they want us to do for like the cost, like the price that they're willing to pay just doesn't feasibly make sense. So we're like, oh, we just couldn't make it work. We know we would underdeliver compared to what you need for that. So those ones are quite easy to make a call.
Hmm.
I think it's more when it's something. So we had someone approach us recently to do a research project, and I really liked the team. I really liked the the thing that they were proposing in terms of the underlying research theme. But it was just it didn't quite fit into our area of expertise, and like we could have done it with our technology, but we would have had to just build something slightly different to make that research work. So essentially, almost like our USP and why people find us interesting for research is because it's a product that people are using embedded into their everyday lives, right? So it's
Mm.
actually a really interesting data set for how does something work longitudinally and how does it work in a very naturalistic environment versus a sort of lab-based um, experiment where you bring them into, a university and they have to do these tasks and it's, they're not experiencing something in the way that they would in their real lives. Um, and so that's kind of when people are perceiving us as almost like a research product, that's what they're looking for the value for. But what it means is that they want certain functionality been built in to measure certain things, which aren't necessarily to do with benefit to the user. It's more about collecting data, which is interesting to the researcher. And so for us, we have to turn those things down because even though it is interesting, it's not fulfilling our core reason of being, which is, making the day-to-day life better for our neurodivergent users. Thing I would say is that it's a shame though, because a lot of it's not like they're completely random questions coming in. They all are to do with neurodiversity and trying to create a general environment or world which is better for neurodivergent people. So it does still fit our mission, but it's just more, it almost doesn't fit our solution because we build technology products for mental health. We don't build technology products to support research. So that's,
Hmm.
I guess, maybe the slight tension that we always have.
Yeah. And how, as a founder, do you build in reflection into your day to day?
So I am actually very bad at reflection. Bearing in mind that I run a mental health company. It's one of those things where I should probably. So I actually really like the new product that we built, the LLM based one. And I've been trying to not use it so much just because of like how high the costs are. So I was like, I can't use this as my personal therapist. But as a team, we do weekly retros, and so
Hmm.
that's actually good because they're company wide retros. I mean, we're a small team, so it doesn't take too much time. They really act as both a kind of practical operational touch points. So how could we have done better on certain things over the week, but also celebration of things which have gone well. And then also just a way for people to express how they're feeling and what they're going through. So that as a collective, I think has been really powerful for us as a team. And yeah, I think individually, I just kind of ad hoc reflect here and there. So Felix, so my co-founder and I, we have our own. So obviously we have company-wide stand-ups, which are on Zoom and a little bit more, quick and to the point. And then on Fridays, Felix and I will just have our own stand-up where we just like talk on the phone, like on WhatsApp. And that's actually and that's kind of like for us to like have a little bit of a gossip, just like catch up. But those conversations will go from, talking about something personal to suddenly, oh, like I had this idea or I read this thing. And so that is actually maybe, yeah, the proving ground for a lot of the things which eventually might go into the product or determine the company's trajectory or strategy. But we're kind of doing it through dialogue as well and
Hmm.
sharing ideas rather than it being a formal reflective process. But those are
Yeah.
definitely things that, you know, I know, him and I really value as a founding team. So like we have it in our diaries that we have like an hour off on Friday mornings just to have those conversations. So I
Oh,
guess
that's
it could
nice.
be our reflective process.
Yeah, that's lovely. What's the bravest decision you've made after starting COGS AI, and what did you learn from it?
Where you get your money from, I would say, is kind of like a difficult decision that you're constantly thinking about as a founder. You're thinking about, okay, which type of investors do I bring on? You're thinking about like the revenue that's coming in and reinvesting that into product. You're thinking about like, how do I grow the team? And I think for us, just making sure we have always aligned with, say, like investors who really understand what we're doing, either because they're neurodivergent or because they have a social impact lens, has been really helpful for us because it has provided like a lot of support when things are hard, but it also keeps us quite it stops us being like, oh, and maybe we should change the product and start selling it as a kind of like a premium neurodiversity service and charge people like £50 a month for it. It keeps us kind of more on the mission, which is good.
And looking at back around those moments of pause, say the conversations you have with Felix every Friday morning, or the stand-ups you have with the team, how has that shaped the way you lead today, or will, or how you lead in the future?
I think making space for those conversations which aren't purely about work and tasks and things that we need to get done. So we're a fully remote team. I probably should have mentioned that. And that works really well from a neurodivergent perspective because it means that you can be a lot more flexible with how you structure your day and even like where you live. So Felix doesn't even live in the same country as the rest of us, for example. But obviously what that means is that you lose sometimes that more personal element, which can lead to trust, which can then lead to inspiration and good ideas and just being able to create together. And so actually building out those moments intentionally. So yeah, if somebody is going a little bit off topic on stand up, talking about, something that they really love. So we all have strange kind of passions and hobbies. And then you kind of let them roll for a little bit, even though I kind of remember sort of running stand ups at, a different company where you kept it on like, no, we're just talking about the tasks here and being snappy. But actually kind of maybe things that might be considered bad habits from like a more formal I guess like product management perspective, actually allowing them a little bit more just to bond the team.
Yeah, that's great, isn't it? And it's interesting when you think about in that remote context, um, where all of you are working remotely, and it's kind of you have those little moments to also maybe just check in with people. Um, so you've shared how you reflect and grow as a founder. I'd love to zoom out now and look at what impact all of this is actually having on people's lives. Can you share with the listeners one story of someone whose life has been changed by COGS AI and what changed for them?
Mm-hmm. I'll actually share a story of a way that somebody used a product in a way that we didn't intend or design for, because I think that's
Uh-huh.
also really nice, a nice impact that you can sometimes have. So it was a user who had actually found our product through a direct to consumer route. And we're not sure how, maybe because they'd read about us. So rather than coming through the NHS, and they were neurodivergent and they were in supported living. So they were living, relatively, they still needed support, but they also could live independently and sort of had money to spend on their own things. And part of that money was actually spending some stuff on support tools that they felt were good for them. And so they found the COGS app, they embedded it into just their day to day routines. And they wrote to us and saying, actually, the reason that they find the app so useful is that it gives them a way to communicate how they're feeling and what they're going through to the sort of people who are caring for them in the supported living environment. And so we hadn't actually thought about that. We thought about it as being a very personal tool that people used for reflection and understanding themselves. And the fact that this user was then being able to take the things that were in the app and actually show the app to someone who is looking after them. And that person could then understand that user a little bit better and then provide better support themselves was something we hadn't, really built in or thought about building into it. And yeah, that was a really nice moment for us. So it was just, having an impact beyond what we designed for as well.
That's such a lovely moment. And when you realized that or you heard that story, how did you feel in that moment as a founder of COGS AI?
Obviously you feel great. Like it makes things feel worth it because of that. And it's maybe it's not even measurable, but it's something that is making them qualitatively feel like their life is better. That just like feels so good as well.
What's the time to impact for a typical customer or beneficiary? I mean, we can focus on the beneficiary here or the customer. Walk me through what happens in that window between first use or first commissioning and early signals of impact, and where kind of COGS fits into that journey, because it's a journey, right? It's not just like
Mhm.
one and done. It's like that kind of journey over time.
We designed their onboarding to be as useful as possible. So actually designing the onboarding as if it was a reflective exercise for the neurodivergent person who comes through. And so it supports people to understand their own neurodivergent profile, but then also understand a concept called neurodivergent burnout, which is something that kind of like the burnout everyone experiences, but for neurodivergent people, it might manifest in a slightly different way. So some of your neurodivergent traits will start to feel more difficult. And yeah, just taking people through that exercise in a way that isn't just telling them stuff, but actually asking them to engage and think about their own experiences and then using that to then personalize the app experience. So right at the beginning, they've done almost like a whole learning journey, which even if they never use the app again, they've already learned something about how their brain and their body works. And so for us, that's almost just like the first moment where we know that we've made an impact. But over the long term, so for us, again, like 30 days is the first real, like, significant milestone for us. Like, how much are people using it over 30 days? So we have 30% 30-day retention, which we're really happy about. And then for us, the next thing is to figure out how do we kind of build that out to longer than 30 days as well. But within that first month, it's really about people taking the learnings that they created around their brain and body during onboarding and then build that out into understanding how their body changes as they just go through their day-to-day routines and their lives. So that's almost what they want to have achieved by the first month. It's how can I understand myself better? And then when it comes to month 2, it's about, okay, now that I've started to understand myself better and how I respond to things, how can I then um, either change my life or find solutions that help me, just be in a better mental health state. So it's really that second piece that we're onto at the moment. And for us, it's that's kind of why we built out the LLM product as well. Because for those, so like to understand how you respond to yourself, it has to be so personalized that actually kind of the more generalized advice that you can just give in like a static mobile app isn't enough. Like it needs to be like highly specific to your brain, your body, and also what you're going through at that moment.
So every solution creates or has kind of ripple effects, right? Anything kind of coming into anyone's life kind of has a ripple effect. Have there been any unintended consequences, good or bad, that taught you something important about how people live with your product?
This just came out of the user interviews where you realize you are just a tiny part of the support that they need. I think I would say that is probably maybe one of the like the cons of technology within healthcare contexts, because actually so much of someone's health is about the environment that they're in, obviously about the healthcare system and the support that they can get from that system, but even things about, how can they shape their, their workplace environment or their home environment to best support their health. Like so much of preventative support needs to come from what's around you, and mobile app is one piece of that. And I think for us, what we've realized is the best thing that we can do is give people enough information about themselves that they can then start to understand how they could change the world around them.
As the business grows, how do you make sure your impact grows with it and stays true to your purpose?
It's what we mentioned before, where as a team, because a lot of us are neurodivergent, we're all just very aligned on having that user impact. And so I think it happens quite naturally. And then similarly, because our investors are also impact aligned, every single, I suppose, person who's supporting with the decision making is also helping us make the right decisions as well. Because I think it's almost a death by a thousand cuts if you think about how people could veer off the impact trajectory. It's not, oh, I'm suddenly going to switch from doing something impactful to building something, like moving into like a crypto exchange. Like you're not thinking, it's just, it'll be like you'll make tiny little decisions, which will feel like the good decision for the business at the time, but it might just be pushing you off track from a mission perspective. So having more people around you that are helping you make the right choice when those small little decision comes up, I think has been the key for us.
What's the biggest barrier between where you are now and the next level of impact to reach more people?
Because we work with the UK public sector, so the NHS, things just take a lot of time and there's a lot of procurement protocols and regulatory things that you have to deal with, and even political things. So whenever there's a change of government, everything slows down. Whenever things are changing, even within the Department of Health and Social Care, so like political things that we don't necessarily know is going on, we'll have an indicator that something is going on because you'll see that the government contracts that get put out to the public will start to slow down. You won't see very many new ones, or conversations that we've been having with trusts will slowly start to, people be like, oh, let's just like push that call for a month. And it's all just because they're having pressure put on them to, pause spending or to make certain decisions around budget. And so for us, yeah, it's really the whatever that underlying political process is that is sort of slowing us down in terms of the impact that we can make.
Yeah. And is there a system rule or policy change that would 10x your impact and reduce the size of the problem more than any feature you release?
Mhm. What's interesting about the way that neurodiversity services are provided at the moment, especially for adults, is that the NHS is the gatekeeper before anyone can get any support or any information about how neurodiversity works, how their brain works, and how to deal with things. And because it's so under resourced and people are sitting on these waiting lists, that's kind of why people are going for different, maybe more unofficial sources of information, say going on social media, for example, or trawling through whatever ChatGPT kind of throws up, which is, there is still good stuff there. It's just hard for a user to understand and filter through what's good and, what's, potentially misinformation. And so actually the biggest difference that the NHS could make would be creating a different type of system where the gatekeeper to support isn't getting a formal diagnosis that takes, a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, but building in something earlier where people can start to get more information about how they work and use that in a formal way to then request support, say, from employers. Because schools actually do this very well. So a lot of schools, because they know how long it takes to get a formal diagnosis, once they start getting enough data points from teachers or from the family around a child and their needs, then they can already start to put in that support without there being a formal diagnosis. And obviously that's because schools are working with young people day in and day
Mm.
out. So they understand the young person, they have the flexibility to be able to adapt things to them. And, as an adult, if you're going through the NHS service, it's much harder for for them to have that in-depth understanding of you. But just, there's so many tools out there, like COGS is one of them, but there are, multiple ways in which the NHS could build out a low touch, not a diagnostic process, but more almost like a self-reflective understanding process that could then be used in a formal way for people to request support from their employers, for example.
Mm. How would changing that not only help you but everyone else in the ecosystem? Like, what does that do for like the ecosystem as a whole?
It's taking neurodiversity out of the realm of being something medicalized or something that needs a clinical solution, and understanding that so much of it is actually in the personal realm as well. It is fundamentally a personal problem or a personal situation. It's your brain is different. And so everything in the whole world where you interface with the world is going to be slightly different. And the more that you understand that and have that self knowledge, that gives you so much power just to go out and live your life in a different way, or even perceive yourself in a different way, because you're not judging yourself as being wrong, or that something's like, that you're ill or that you have a disorder. Whereas the way things are built at the moment is very clinical. And that's kind of why the system works in the way it is, because it's made for people who, need a clinical solution. But there's so many people who don't need that solution, and they actually just need more support from the people around them and from the structures around them, whether that's workplace or whether that's their school, for example.
And I know you've gone deep into this area, and I think it'd be worthwhile if you had a few minutes to kind of explain to the listeners the difference between the kind of the medical model and the social model,
Yeah.
because I think that plays deeply into the way that you work.
So this applies not just to neurodiversity, but to disability in general. So there's a concept, as you said, called the medical model of disability, and there's one called the social model of disability. And so essentially the medical model is saying that any type of difference is something that can be treated, through a therapy or through pharmacology. So like popping a pill for something. And what you're trying to treat is a symptom, and assuming that if you change people, you bring them back to the norm and they'll be better because they want to be back to the norm of where everybody is. Whereas the more social model says actually a thing which is disabling people is the fact that the environment is built for the norm and it's not built for difference. So would you be considered disabled if the environment itself was catered to you? So I think a really, good example is obviously most people in the world, aren't visually impaired. So we built a world where you rely so much on visual cues. You just assume that people can get around the world that way. Whereas if you're visually impaired, you are disabled because the environment isn't built for the way in which you take cues from the world. And how would you design it if the norm was that everyone experienced the world as you did? And so I think that's kind of the biggest difference. It's like, are you trying to treat something and cure something? Or are you trying to change the environment to actually make it more accessible for different types of needs that people have?
Before I go into the final section, I want to go just a little bit one step back towards a system rule that would need to change. Who would need to be at that table, Zareen, to make that change?
Wow. So anyone who determines how systems are structured within the NHS. But I think the big problem with the NHS is that it's not even, yes, you can have West Streeting say something at the top, but that has to trickle down and then be implemented across this very federated system that we have across the NHS. So yeah, you would need to have politicians at the top, and then the key decision makers at each NHS trust who have got the funding and the political enablement to make these changes. And I think that's really the big thing, because actually the individual NHS commissioners that we work with, everyone that we speak to in the NHS is doing the right thing. They're thinking about this in the right way. They're trying to make little system changes or little changes in their part of the system, but they're trying to do it from a bottom up approach. And really, if you need to change the system in such a significant way, you're changing the whole way in which neurodiversity is considered and then dealt with by the system. It needs to come from the top. And so, yeah, that's probably the biggest challenge that the NHS is facing at the moment when it comes to this area.
We're now moving to the lightning round. What's a permission slip you give yourself or your team?
Working when your brain feels like working. So we have one checkpoint every day, which is stand up at a certain time. And after that, obviously, if you have meetings in the diary, you turn up to that. But we just assume that people will get the work done whenever works for them. So obviously, if your brain works better at 3 a.m, that's cool. Don't expect people to reply to your Slack messages then. But just enabling people to essentially be adults. They know how they work best and letting them do that.
Whose voice are you most afraid of losing as you grow?
That's a good question. I know this is supposed to be a lightning round, but I've never even thought about that before. I think the worry for me is who is enabling us to grow? Is it a different type of investor? Is it a different type of company that we're partnering with? And do they have the same alignment as our current investors or the current people who've helped us make decisions to actually keep us on the mission versus thinking purely in terms of how is this going to, how can we increase revenue as quickly as possible?
The last thing you change your mind about?
I change my mind all the time, probably my hair. So this I just went pink recently and I was like, oh, is that a good idea? But I don't know.
Most recent thing you learnt about your customers?
So we've started exploring the US market and actually the differences. There are so many shared similarities, but there are some core differences actually in the way that society perceives neurodiversity. I would say kind of almost like US general perception of neurodiversity versus the UK, and how that then influences you as a neurodivergent person and how you even talk about your neurodiversity.
As you grow, what's the one thing you'll never compromise on?
I just don't see us compromising on the mission because I feel like if the company goes down a path where it's just trying to squeeze money out of neurodivergent people because it is a big market, I think me and Felix will just jump ship, right? Like we're like whatever, obviously like that sounds bad, like, oh, we'll just leave it, but we wouldn't want to be part of something that is, taking away from the community rather than adding to it and enabling it.
The moment that made you stop and think, this is why we do it?
I mentioned we send out those feedback forms, like very specific ones based on how people use the product, which is, I guess, a little bit of a selection bias because you're sending a form to people who are engaging, so you know that they like it. But when you hear about why, because people have a free text bit as well, and they write in about actually like what they find valuable, that's just like a little, maybe it's like our version of the affirmations that we built into the product. It's just like, oh, that's nice. Like it just feels like you're getting a little dose of, yes, I'm making an impact on someone's life.
Nice. When you think of scale, do you picture growing bigger or making the problem smaller?
Interesting. I've never thought about it in terms of making the problem smaller, but I love that framing of it. We've always just thought about it as touching more lives, just getting it into the hands of more people. And I think, yeah, that's maybe so fundamental to the way in which startup, even just impact metrics, is very much like how, like how big is this rather than what's the depth of it or even like how small is it. And yeah, so we've always thought about it from the reaching more people, but I like the concept of how can we think about it as the problem getting smaller.
If you could whisper something to your earlier self just before you started COGS AI, what would you say?
Probably you're going to learn so much because I think, yeah, it is exciting and it's fun to do this. Obviously, there's like things which are hard all the time, but you're just constantly learning, even in those scenarios where things are difficult. You're just learning things about yourself, about how you work in a team, about just how a company operates in this space that you're never going to learn from any other type of role. And I think that is just something that, as a person, I personally find very motivating. And knowing that right at the beginning, rather than, I don't know if people start a company thinking like, oh, I'm doing this to learn. It's more like, oh, I'm doing this to solve a problem or to be more independent. But actually, you're going to learn so much more through that process.
Thank you so much for sharing your story so far. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Before we wrap, where can people find out more about COGS AI or connect with you?
So on our website, www.cogs-ai.com, so you can find out a little bit more about the product. You can download it, have a play around. Or on LinkedIn, that's probably the best way to find me. So Zareen Ali. We're not really that big on socials because we work with NHS. We haven't had to do a lot of social media. So probably the best way is LinkedIn if people want to reach out.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this conversation, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, and leave a quick 5-star rating or a short review on your favourite podcast app. It really helps more people discover these stories from the reflective impact entrepreneurs.